Good afternoon and welcome to this panel discussion on reshaping Africa's narrative, branding for success. My name is Victor Oladokun, and I'm the Director of Communication at the African Development Bank. Today we're going to be engaged in a fact-based conversation that brings together quite a number of transformative African leaders who, in their respective ways, have owned and continue to shape the African narrative and are helping to brand it for success. Allow me to introduce our panelists. South Africa's Minister of Public Enterprise, the Honorable Pravin Gordhan. Kindly give him a warm round of applause. Make him feel welcome. Senegal's Minister of Economy, Planning and Cooperation, the Honorable Amadou Hott. Easily the hottest minister in Africa. Alain Ebobisse, CEO of Africa 50. Rakesh Wahi, founder of the ABN Group. And Lulu Akinwumi, chairman of Prima Garnet, a leading regional advertising company. So to help set the stage, and we're holding this panel today within the context of Africa's very ambitious investment goals. Last year we had tremendous success in terms of investment interest, and in quite a number of circles, I guess the impression sometimes is all we need to do is relax and then the flows of capital will just come in quite easily. But the fact of the matter is that we do have to deal with perceptions. Perceptions either of our brand as Africa, our brand as African nations, or perceptions of risk. So, what we're going to be talking about today is what we must do differently to sell Africa as a desirable investment destination. And what are those out-of-the-box ideas that can be game changers for the Africa brand? Now, to kick us off, I just wanted to put this graph up on the screen so we can take a quick look at it before our session begins. These are gaps in perception by organizations, companies that are doing business in Africa on the colored side, in yellow. They're established in Africa, they're doing business in Africa, they're from the former Soviet states, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Western Europe, Central America, North America, Latin America, Oceania, and Asia. And on the right-hand side, the white column, are organizations that are not doing business, do not have a presence in Africa. And I just want us to take a look for a moment at the disparity of perceptions. Those that are doing business in Africa believe that Africa is a lot more attractive, a lot less risky than those who are not on the continent. So what are we trying to say here? Perception, many times, is reality. So we have a job to do. We have to change perceptions. We have to engage in it. We cannot outsource that responsibility. We have to own it in order to shape our continent and create opportunities for investment capital to flow onto the continent. So I'm going to start our session this morning and kick it off, or rather this afternoon, with Minister Pravin Gordhan. And I'm going to ask, what's your take on brand perception from a policy perspective? Because at the end of the day, branding is not just about media or communication. It's a very, very complex and multifaceted issue. So, Minister Gordhan, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, and greetings to my colleagues on the panel. Thank you very much for this opportunity to have a debate on a very important matter. The first is to concur with what our program director has said, that perceptions matter, and perceptions are often seen as reality. But secondly, if you look at that set of regions around the world, Africa is seen as one country in many of those regions by many businesses, whereas we have 54 countries. And the basic point is knowledge of Africa and awareness of our history, of what our continent has as its diversity, both in terms of human and material resources, is very limited. So the first battle, I suppose, we have to fight is the knowledge battle. How do we get a better understanding amongst different investors in different parts of the world about what the African continent has to offer and what different regions and countries have to offer as well. The second is what some economists have called the demonstration effect. In other words, it's not just about branding and narrative, it has to be backed by something that works. And I think today, across the continent, we do have energy projects, infrastructure projects, different forms of exploration of natural resources and agricultural resources as well, and innovative young people that act as our demonstration effect. But the question would be, do we communicate that effectively? Do we actually communicate that things do work on the continent? We're not just a so-called basket case, which probably is still the perception amongst a third or more of the constituencies that we actually want to reach. So the demonstration effect, I believe, is key. The third, as the theme of this conference says very clearly, we need to take both a country-orientated approach, but also a continent-orientated approach. And so we talk about an integrated Africa. And that's where sometimes we get in our own way, so to speak, because our narrative doesn't match our practice. That often regionalism or countries' boundaries matter more than what we can achieve as a continent. And the African Development Bank, amongst other institutions, are well placed to help us to fight against our own worst instincts in this particular regard and get the right balance between an integrated picture being projected and what each of us has to offer, either as businesses, regions, or countries as well. The fourth is, if you like, the economic proposition. I think businesses want to know where they can make money, to put it in simple terms. So the risk-reward ratio and the understanding of the risk and reward ratio becomes quite critical. And many businesses have taken risks in many parts of Africa that many others will not. But they understand that by taking those risks, they're going to get massive rewards at the end of that process as well. So how do we communicate better than we currently do what the risk-reward ratio is, and particularly on the reward side, what can businesses invest in and walk away with, which is important for their bottom line. And perhaps my last point at this stage is that billionaires and the elites in many parts of the world, including this famous 100 Roundtable in the United States of leading CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, have learned through social and geopolitical and political developments that profit and purpose now need to be combined. By that we mean that we don't only seek profit, both in their own domestic environments, but in foreign environments as well, but you need to balance it with purpose. And in the African context, I think we need to sell the purpose as well, i.e., what do we do about youth employment? What do we do about poverty? How do we invest more in the social wage in our continent? And how do they share some of the benefits that they derive from our continent with the continent itself, so that this doesn't become an entirely extractive process? Let me pause there for now, but those were probably some of the thoughts that might matter in countering perceptions, but also demonstrating effectively that we are a continent that does matter today, but certainly will matter into the future as well.
Thank you very much, Minister Gordon. And I like what you say about the demonstration effect here. We'll come back to that a little bit later as we talk about success and branding. But I just want to do a very quick follow-up here in terms of as Minister of Public Policy, for you, and it may sound like a no-brainer, but it really isn't. One of the things that we have challenges with in many African countries are policy flip-flops.
Yeah.
And this is a major challenge for investors. Why is it that we don't get it?
Well, I think, when we talk about branding and perceptions, is, if you like, the external situation that we make reference to. We've also got to look at ourselves in the mirror in a harsh way, excuse me, and in a frank way, and ask what is it that we need to do better if we're going to address some of those questions. And in regard to creating the right conditions, there's a phrase we've developed in some of our work here called back to basics, which I'm sure you've heard of elsewhere as well. So what are the basics we need to put in place that are non-negotiable if we are to actually demonstrate that there won't be those policy flip-flops, that you have stable governance, both in the context of the democracies that we have on our continent, but also in public institutions and private institutions as well. So some of those back to basic elements or basic elements would be the rule of law, the certainty about policy beyond the 4- and 5-year terms that politicians normally work with. The inclination of politicians is always, when you enter office, you've got to change what your predecessor did. And that's a temptation that we've got to fight. So how do we, instead of having personalized policies, talk about institutionalized policies so that beyond the individual, those policy frameworks actually survive? And where there's need for adaptation, then the adaptation happens in a very transparent way. The second basic would be in relation to corporate governance, be they in state-owned institutions or private businesses as well. Now, that notion of corporate governance varies in different parts of the world, and some things are acceptable in some part and others not elsewhere. But their transparency about the financials, accountability to boards, shareholders, be that shareholder government or an external investing public or an internal public as well, and consequence management. If there's bad things happening or the right things are not happening in the right way, then the consequences must flow in this particular regard, and politics shouldn't actually intervene in that kind of context. So perhaps we want to explore what are the other basic foundation stones that we need to put right, many of which we've done, I believe, in the last 15 years, 10 years or so, but something that we can actually build on.
All right. Thank you very much. Minister Amadou Hott, well, your career spans several worlds, the worlds of the private sector, public sector now, and prior to that, the development world. You know, probably more than anybody else in this room, as well as quite a number of the investors here in this room, how difficult it is to raise finance and capital, investment capital for projects. How important to your mind is national branding to attracting foreign investments?
Thank you very much, Victor. Those who know my voice and we're used to it, you will realize that it's very different because I started losing it this morning. Traveling to South Africa was very challenging for me at this time because South African Airways is no longer flying to Senegal. And since I have the Minister of Public Enterprise here, maybe I'll use the opportunity to pitch for a return of South African Airways on the Dakar-Johannesburg.
Aren't there any Ghanaians in this audience?
And as you know, Victor, perception matters, and we said it. And because of the perception that Africa is riskier than many parts of the world, we still see investors who demand higher double-digit returns when they are investing in Africa. And because they still believe that the risk here is much higher than in other places. And those who understand the risk in Africa have really switched their actually requirements. And we know, for example, in the energy sector, some IPP investors now were very happy with having an IRR of around 12, 13%. But some are still around the 19, 17, and 20s, which is, of course, not acceptable. Perception matter, and we must really, as governments, private sector, do what is needed so that the rest of the world knows what the great things that are happening on our continent. If you look at, for example, Senegal, over the last 5 years, our average growth rate has been 6.6%. And I don't think that everybody knows that. We've started a new fast train, a fast rail, 35 kilometers from Dakar to the new city. From idea to inauguration, 4 years. It takes typically 10 years in many countries to do that. And that rail will go all the way to the airport, like the How train, to cover the 55 kilometers. And you mentioned earlier that many governments, when they come in place, they try to undo what their predecessors have done. In Senegal, it has been the contrary. We find our predecessor starting a new airport. We nicely finished that airport, and now it's one of the best airports in Africa. We find the predecessor that has built toll roads, basically, to go to airport. Our new president, Macky Sall, said, I will build a fast train. A fast train in a country like Senegal, I mean, it's unheard of, right? And it's the technology, the state-of-the-art technology, funded, of course, by the African Development Bank, the French AFD, and the Islamic Development Bank, so through partnerships. So for us, we need to showcase more the great things that are happening on our continent. If you look at the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is an amazing agreement, now we've become the largest free trade area in the world. But I'm not sure if we are doing enough to sell it to the rest of the world. And that responsibility lies not only with the governments, individually, it lies with the African Union, but also it lies with institutions like the African Development Bank. That's why I would definitely suggest the African Development Bank to create maybe an African branding facility that will provide some soft funding for technical assistance and resources to brand the countries individually, those countries that are doing very well. So only countries that are doing well in terms of reforms, in terms of doing business, in terms of governance, should benefit from that facilities to showcase the great things that they are doing, but also to encourage other countries to do also very well in terms of the ease of doing business. So maybe I'll stop it for now. Thank you.
Well, great idea, great idea. I love that. That's a really good one. We're going to come to, and then people say right now, you've done amazing things at Africa 15 in a relatively short period of time. You're really pushing the envelope on what it takes to reshape the investment narrative on the continent. From your perspective, what can we do differently and better?
Thank you, Victor. And, it's very difficult, of course, to rebrand or brand the country, and even more so the entire continent. But it's very important, and we need to work very hard on it. Because when people sit on investment committees, in funds, investment funds, even in developing financial institutions, the perception of risk is in everybody's minds when they make those investment decisions. And the way it translates on the ground, it's essentially about longer due diligence periods, more intrusive due diligence, because they basically assume that things won't go well, so they have to protect themselves, asking all kinds of guarantees. So it's very costly not to have a good brand. So it's a very important project. We need to make sure that we fight that. One of the things that we should be doing, and I start with myself and we apply it with discipline whenever we can, whenever you go into these kind of forums or on TV or in conferences, people always ask, if I take the infrastructure space, which I know a bit more, they always ask you the question about what are the challenges in investing in infrastructure in Africa? This is the question that they ask. Now, I always try to pivot, and before I answer that question, I talk about what is actually happening positively. I say, look, there's lots of stuff happening in Africa. There is this fantastic solar program in Egypt called Bemban, 1.5 gigawatts, actually 1,500 megawatts of solar that was implemented in 2.5 years, all funded by the private sector. I think some of those investors are here. Africa 50 was one of the investors in that project. You have countries like Senegal quietly building a number of IPPs, independent power projects. You know, we need to talk much more about these things. You have success stories like the renewable IPP program here in South Africa, which raised billions of dollars. Lecter, I can spend an hour talking about successes. So we need to make sure that we talk about those successes while acknowledging that we have challenges. Of course we have challenges, but we cannot only focus on talking about how to solve those challenges. We need to talk about what is happening on the ground. We need to talk about the fact that we have countries in Africa that are leading countries in the doing business in terms of the best investment climate in the World Bank doing business. Rwanda, Mauritius, Kenya, many, many countries. We need to talk about those stories. We need to talk about the fact that some of those projects are getting implemented fast, but then I also want to to build on what Minister Praveen said earlier, which is to say that we also have to work on ourselves to make sure that when we have those success stories, we have to build on them to continue to do more. It breaks my heart sometimes when I see a country that does the hard work in putting together a transaction, getting it to financial close, and then they stop. They stop, and when they stop, they have to go back to the drawing board when they decide eventually to renew the program. So once we do something, let's catch the momentum and push things, and then investors will follow. They love it. When we did here the renewable IPP program in South Africa, many rounds, you could see that those rounds, after each round, there were more investors coming in because they like success. Success breeds success. So many examples. My friends from Mazem are here. The fantastic project they did in Morocco, solar project, was as that. So once we have those, let's do more of those so that's how we can change perception. And one thing that we need to be very clear, and the Minister Praveen also said that private investors, they like when they make money. And there's nothing wrong with that if they deliver good services. So let's talk about some examples of investors that have invested in Africa, a big project that have made money. I don't know that how many people in this room know that Blackstone, one of the biggest global private equity funds, they sold their stake in Bujagali, a big hydro dam in Uganda. Okay, I'm not going to disclose how much money they made. Let's just say that they were happy. So we have those kind of stories. We have to talk about those stories while actually doing stuff on the ground. At Africa 50, just to finish on that, we are a smaller institution. We are a DFI, but with a commercial mandate owned by 28 African countries so far, the African Development Bank, two African central banks. I think more than the money that those shareholders gave us, they gave us the mandate to operate commercially so that we have a decision-making process which is fast. We say yes or no very quickly. We say no quickly as well. We don't always say yes. But it's important that we make those decisions quickly because sometimes the institutions, financial institutions, will string you along, will take 2 years before telling you no. And in the meantime, you've wasted your time. So it's about implementing quickly, making sure that we deliver quickly, and talking about what we are doing.
Well, I'm going to come to Rakesh, and I have a double question for you, but let me play the angel's advocate here for a moment. We've heard what Alain says about telling our stories. We must tell our stories. But I think if we take a look at the private and public sector in Africa, and many institutions, communication really takes the rear guard. Communication is never part of the process. Many times it tends to be an afterthought or it is not very well funded. What can we do to change that culture? Secondly, you have taken the lead on shaping Africa's narrative through your TV platform, Forbes Africa. What was it that you saw that others didn't that took you on this journey?
Thank you, Victor. Before I respond to the questions, I do want to contextualize, the businesses that we are in. I do have a media hat, but We also are investors in other industries. As a family, we're based in Dubai. We've been there for about 30 years. We have an interest in IT, in media, and in education. We represent Microsoft in 8 countries, starting from Sri Lanka all the way to the Philippines. And we own 2 universities, one in Dubai and one in Accra in Ghana. And then we've got our media businesses here in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is CNBC Africa and Forbes Africa. The reason I'm talking about this is not so much to talk about what we built, but the experience that I have in operating in 20 countries. And Africa is not unique in the problems that we face. In 2002, when I went to Sri Lanka to set up an IT business, there was a war going on there. And people said, what the hell are you going to do in Sri Lanka? But it's your belief. When you look at a market as an investor, you look at the opportunity, you look at the risks, you look at everything else that everybody talks about. But it's your own gut and your own belief and what you're prepared to put into it for the long term. Because if you're looking at short-term gains, then you're going to have a lot of problems in any market that you get into. So the first thing that I always tell people is that change the way you think about investments. You've got to look at what I phrase internally as cathedral investing. Cathedral investing is about building cathedrals, places of worship, and churches. You're basically talking about 30 to 50-year investment cycles where you say that, look, we're here for the long haul. We are not here for the short term. And that's the mindset with which we came to Africa. Now, when I came here in 2004, I had never been south of Egypt. We had looked at some opportunities in Egypt, and I had never been south. And when I came down, we had the same misconceptions that most investors have when they come into Africa, that it's gloom and doom, and the media carries all kinds of stories about what's going on. And when I walked into South Africa, and the drive from Tambo, and I always talk about it, to my hotel in Rosebank, this was one of the greatest journeys that I made. And the day I took that drive in October of 2004, we said we're going to do something here. So despite this gloom and doom that we were being exposed to in terms of media perceptions, we found an opportunity in that itself. Because we had invested in 3 CNBC franchises earlier and went ahead and said, look, this makes a lot of sense to actually try and rebrand the continent. There's a lot to be done here because there are a lot of multinationals that are making money in the continent. There are a lot of great business opportunities. There are a lot of things that are going on. But nobody talks about those good stories. Everybody talks about what's wrong on the continent. And I think that's the narrative that had to change. And this is what we worked on for the last 12 years. We've produced about 30,000 hours of content. We've done about 100 magazines in Forbes. We've showcased entrepreneurs from the continent. And it's for the first time that Africans are being projected in the light that you truly deserve. Because there's a lot happening in the continent. So while the perceptions may be negative, they are no different than in other parts of the world. So how do you make it better? And that's the key issue. So you don't want to be an also-ran. You want to also be part of a journey that is built on success. And a wise man once said that it's not just only that you got to be good, you got to make sure that others know that you're good. And that's where the perception changes. You got to make sure that you talk about these stories to the external environment. The flow of capital today takes place from the developed world to the developing world. And therefore, you got to make sure that the best messages are going out into the developing world. So how do you do that? And what we found is that, and we've talked about a fragmented Africa. So while we do talk about a continent, there are 54 countries. Everybody has their own agenda in terms of getting FDI. But the key issue is, how do you put a unique, cohesive strategy for the continent? How do you work towards, and I think some of the points that came out was, can we not, you got 6 presidents here, but there's so many others that get together in forums. Why can't every country put together $5 to $10 million and build a corpus of, $400 to $500 million? Use that into an effective branding strategy for the continent. And this is not about a single country. It's about actually building something cohesive for the continent so that you can take those stories out and change that perception that people carry that, coming here is going to be dangerous. It's as dangerous coming to Johannesburg as going to New York. You know where to go and where not to go. Now, if people talk negatively about it, there's something seriously wrong. So you've got to change that. And I think if we all take responsibility, take pride in being Africans, put together a war chest, and change this perception, we can make the difference that we want to see.
Thank you very much. Well, it's said that the best brands on earth are packaged in ways that provide awareness, a motivation to acquire, and the desire to consume, or as in the case of our countries or the continent, opportunities to invest in. So, my next question comes to Lulu Akinwumi, who for many years was the head of Ogilvy Mather for Africa, I believe. What must Africa and African nations do better to win the hearts and minds of investors from a marketing and an advertising perspective? Are we doing a good job, and what can we do differently? I'd like to hear some out-of-the-box ideas here.
Thank you very much, Victor. It's quite clear from what the other members of the group have said that we need to look at a few things very differently. Whatever we have tried to do in the past obviously has not worked, and there's a need to define what our narrative is going to be in Africa. That is missing, the gap is there. And in defining this, I think there are three things we need to be quite clear about in terms of what are we communicating to the rest of the world, what are we saying to them, selling to them that's going to compel them to focus on Africa and want to invest in Africa. And I think the first one is the message. What message do we have? What has been our message up to this time? How much of our message is going out? The second one is the audience. Who are we supposed to be talking to? Are we reaching them? And if we are reaching them at all, are we reaching them effectively? The third, which is also critical, and I'm happy that he's here, is how do we reach them? Right now, there are, literally speaking, hundreds of communication platforms all over the world. A few years ago, you had just maybe radio, TV, and the traditional media. Now, you've got the social media. You've got all kinds of media opportunities. How are we taking advantage of this? Africa needs to change its story. Unfortunately, most of what has been said about the continent to date have not come from within the continent itself. Africa needs to change its story. We need to change the narrative. We need to communicate the huge potentials that are in the continent. And there are a lot of truly positive values that we can communicate to especially attract global investors.
How do you propose that we best do this? Not just for a global audience.
Yes.
I think quite a number of the comments today have been about a global audience, but I think there'll be general agreement that we have not even sold ourselves to ourselves within the continent. So it looks like it's a double job there, reaching out to the global community, but also reaching out effectively to other African countries. How do you propose that we do this?
I think one of the things we need to do prior to this time, and I was on the Ogilvy, I was part of the Ogilvy for a long time, is we have not allowed Africans to tell our story. Most of the time we have allowed non-Africans to tell the African story. And there is no way, it doesn't matter what anybody says, the kind of commitment you would, consistent commitment in communicating the story must come from Africa, because it's got to come from the heart. It's got to be communicated with a lot of passion. We are talking of brand marketing, we are talking of creating brands, sustaining brands. And the best people that can tell the story of Africa truly, without any doubt at all, are Africans.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come back to you with one last question in a few moments, but I want to give our audience an opportunity to ask the panel questions. And when I do come back to you, I want you to give me just one really powerful, out-of-the-box idea for how we move the agenda forward in terms of our brand. So, over to the audience. I see a hand in the back over there. And we'll take the questions in batches. We'll come to the lady to the right over here. And then I see somebody else up front here. So 3 questions so far. In the process of these questions going on, if I see other hands raised, I'll come to you. So we'll start in the back, go to the right over here. Actually, I see 2 hands over here, and then we'll come to the left. Kindly mention your name and direct your question, preferably, to a specific member of the panel. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much. My name is Derek Ashong. I'm from Ghana. I've built my career in media, entertainment, and technology, currently in Los Angeles and Silicon Valley. I'll direct this to Mr. Akawumi. I very much appreciated what you just said regarding those 3 areas. What is your messaging, your audience, what are the platforms you're using to reach them? I think that we're all very much in agreement that African stories need to be told by Africans, or there will always be sad stories. There will never be triumphant ones. I'm interested in specifically, what do you see that needs to happen, that can be done, that can be facilitated both by government and private investment to improve the quality of African media so that the content that we're delivering is at global standards, so that the stories that we tell on the ground can be exported effectively. And then secondly, to invest in the platforms of the future that are indigenous to the continent, so we're not just relinquishing the methodology of distribution to whatever may be coming or innovated out of the West.
Excellent question. Thank you very much. We'll come right over here.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Nkiru Balon. I am chair of African Women on Board, and I also...
Could you speak directly into the microphone, please? Thank you.
My name is Nkiru Balongo, and I'm chair of African Women on Board, and I also run a strategic communication firm out of Lagos. And I really congratulate you for having this panel. I'm sort of speaking to Mr. Gordon, and you're talking about the demonstration effect, and sort of like looking at the panel and demonstrating that AAFDB is talking about gender and all that stuff. I think it's something we should look into for the next session, next year. And then particularly, one of America's greatest stories is actually the stories out of America, which is Hollywood. What is AFDB, or what are you all doing in terms of investing in the creative industry and seeing that the stories that the creative industry is telling about Africa is what's inspiring to who we are?
And I believe there was another hand raised right over here.
Good evening. My name is Celine Loader. I work out of Lagos and London, and I think I have 2 colleagues on the panel there, maybe former colleagues. My question, comment relates to what my sister here has just said. That was the first part, that if you are talking about branding and perception and presentation, particularly about the subject matter you have talked about, I think there's a small fail with just the presentation in front of us. But the main thing I was going to say before she made her point was, also we're talking about branding, and we heard from various members of the panel some important stories and examples of things that have been done very well. But in this audience here, we haven't had the opportunity visually, which I think also is a missed opportunity, to actually present. For example, if the Rwanda story could be packaged even in a 5-minute presentation to show how good it can be done, and to show to a panel like this, because this is about sharing, learning, and also going to do, that would have been a really, really good way of talking about the subject and also showing what can be done. I hear a lot of, we must do this, we must do that, we must do that, and we've heard this so many times. Just like the president said this morning, just do it. And one of the things we could have done today in this particular session is package some of those things which the gentleman from Forbes and CNBC said, the examples from Ethiopia, the examples from, as I said earlier, Rwanda. Just run a little VT, because these stories do exist. They do. But every year we come to panels like this and we talk about the situation as if it's all doom and gloom and nothing has happened. But I think we need to start just showing it. Just here we have all the facilities, we have a captive audience. Show what has been done and what can be done. One of the most beautiful documentaries out of America is The Men Who Built America. That is something which we can actually talk about the people, I don't want to say men, sorry. The people who are rebuilding our Africa. There's a compelling story there, and I think we can start to tell them in panels like this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the lady right over here.
All right, thank you. My name is Dr. Adora, and I'm the CEO of Mobile Health International. We are a fully integrated telehealth startup focused on Africa, trying to bridge the multiple barriers to accessing healthcare across Africa. My question is directed at Mr. Gordon and anybody else on the panel. As you know, Africa is still lagging behind in the adoption of frontier technologies, and technology is on a very fast pace. What we have found is that, of course, many startup companies are on a rat race to the market, but this is not matched by the response that we get from the government, whether it is in policy formulation or in government buy-ins. We have created a solution that has the potential to immediately change the poor narrative of healthcare across Africa. But we have found that the government's buy-ins are very slow, and the response times are slow. So what are we going to do about this, and in what way can the AFDP facilitate the adoption of frontier technologies before they become obsolete? Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent questions. If you don't mind, I'm going to respond very quickly to the questions that came out of right field over here. Without trying to make any excuses, one of the things that we're very, very particular about at the African Investment Forum is ensuring that there is indeed a balanced representation of panelists. I've got my list here. You don't need to see it, but we did have some cancellations that would have nullified the comment that you made about not having proper gender representation on the platform. I wish that those cancellations hadn't happened, because I think it would have enlivened and really enriched our conversation. So definitely let's connect after this meeting. I'd love to engage you and my dear sister in the back here to see how we can do a much better job next time around. The creative arts and the creative industries in Africa, really, aside from agriculture, which is a huge low-hanging fruit, this is a low-hanging fruit. That's where the younger generation already is. You don't have to convince them. They're creative, they're dynamic, they're innovative, they're already in the space, and there's a huge amount of money to be made in the creative industries. So again, this is an area that I do hope that our investors are beginning to look at. It's not just sports. This is a huge area of great potential. Now, if you look at the United States and if you look at Europe, why is it that these continents dominate the world of media and the world of communication? It's very simple. Those countries bring together the best of people, the best of technologies, and the best of money. Unfortunately, most times in Africa, our approach tends to be one of me, myself, and I. We need to speed up, we need to scale up, and we need to synergize. We cannot do that on our own. We have to collaborate. So it's really about collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. We need to do a whole lot more of that. I'll leave that for now and then come back later on. So I'll go back to our panel. Any takers?
Well, let me, on behalf of the men, apologize to the ladies. If the men agree with me, they should clap, please.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the women amongst us require some open acknowledgement that we slip up, not just in terms of logistics, but otherwise as well. So we apologize for that. The men can sort me out a little bit later if they disagree with me. On the question of case studies, if you like, Rwanda, Ethiopia, and many others, ideas like people who are rebuilding Africa. You might even want to call it building Africa. I think is an excellent one, and I'm sure if we pass a piece of paper around to all of you, there'll be 100 different ideas, which is what we should capitalize on in a conference like this. So the AFTB maybe should invite everyone to suggest a bold new idea, and that'll get us all participating in the project. On the technology front, I'm just wondering whether we have a generation gap between the young, bright, innovative people who are much faster, think a lot deeper, and think a lot more outside of the box, and are not limited by the 30 or 40 or 50 years that we've all been working in different environments, and that might act as a constraint on the one, recognition of new ideas, recognition of new technologies, and the important point you make about quick adaptation of those technologies in our day-to-day work. So today I was exposed to a problem in one of our utilities, and I was wondering why artificial intelligence is not being used to actually analyze the problems much quicker, in a much more defined kind of way, and therefore our response time to those problems will be quicker as well. It's a no-brainer, right? And yet we will spend billions of rands on all sorts of IT projects that don't give sufficient credence to the new technology as well. So I think that's a point well made, and maybe the young people amongst us need to wake some of us up and perhaps even educate us about what are these new ideas. Not every startup and not every new app and not every new idea is going to be relevant in a medium term. So I think we've got to acknowledge that as well and get that balance right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alan?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Minister Praveen said. First of all, I have to acknowledge at Africa 50, the corporation that I lead as a CEO, more than 50% of employees are female, just to make it clear. And in management team, about 33% are female on the board, 33%. We are targeting 50%, so we're making good progress. Just wanted to make sure. And also, just on the innovation/branding side, one of the things that we can also do, in addition to the fantastic ideas that have been promoted in terms of trying to find ways to have visuals, it's actually better sometimes to tell the story, to see the story than to tell it. So good ideas. One thing that we've done at Africa 50, we're launching an innovation challenge to try to solve the last mile internet connectivity issue on the continent. Now, we could have just gone with one solution that we pick and try to implement it. Rwanda, by the way, has been picked, has agreed to be the country where we will test it. But we could have gone just by selecting one technology and trying to apply it. What we decided is to source solutions globally so that people can talk about Africa as looking for the best possible solution to solve, or at least to help solve. We don't believe that we are the only one that could solve it, but we'll contribute to helping solving this internet connectivity. So we have proposals coming from all over the world talking about how dynamic this sector is in Africa. This is also one of the ways that we can brand our continent as a place where things are happening, and hopefully very soon we'll pick the winner and we'll start with implementation of that. And final point, I think there could be a generational gap in terms of those ITT sectors. Certainly people like myself, we understand it, but not as well as some of the younger people. One of the ideas that, or the things that countries like Rwanda have done, they've picked very young ministers in charge of ICTs. In Rwanda, Minister Paula, she graduated from MIT. She's very young and dynamic, and she will be probably a better place to advise as to what kind of policies needs to be implemented to make sure that we are a bit more focused on innovation and stuff like that.
Thank you very much. Yes, can I give him a round of applause also? Yep. And the hottest minister in Africa, Minister Maduhot.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of points. To use this platform, this Africa Investment Forum platform, is an amazing platform to brand Africa. Whatever branding we did last year following the amazing results we had, I think we need to double that, because great things are happening under this platform, and the whole world needs to know that. Point number 2, in Senegal, in terms of innovation and supporting the young talent and technology, we are going to pass a startup bill by end of this year to really help promote young innovators, to promote startups, to change the fiscal regime for startups as well, so that when you start a company and you are not doing very well, you shouldn't be, for example, subject to the same labor laws than a company that has been existing for 10, 15 years. That's a big, big hurdle. So we look at the labor code, but also the tax regime to attract more innovators, for example, in Senegal. One point I wanted to make also is that regardless of what the ranking on doing business is for certain countries, some countries are doing very well despite sometimes a ranking maybe that is not so very good. If you look at, for example, Senegal, we improved our ranking 18 points, right, in 1 year. It's great, and we'll do much better next year. But at the same time, if you look at, for example, the investment that BP is making in the oil and gas sector, the FID was the final investment decision, which for some countries can take 5, 6, 7, sometimes even 10 years to conclude. In Senegal, it was the fastest ever. This is BP. You can ask BP. And the project was very complex because we had Mauritania, and we were sharing the reserve 50-50. So the countries had to agree. Fiscal regime agreed. Everything agreed before you can reach final investment decision. It was done in a record time. BP talks about it everywhere, but we need to talk about it everywhere to show that our leaders can fast-track things. They can make decisions that can really push everybody and make everybody in the room and say, you don't leave until you get this done. And it is being done in many countries in Africa. If you look at Morocco, the Noor Ouarzazate, for example, this is a great example. Not many people know that the African Development Bank was the first DFI into Noor Ouarzazate, which is one of the largest solar zones in the world in terms of, in terms of CSP. You have one of their biggest partners, which is Aqua Power, doing great things also across Africa and Middle East. But it's not well known that African Development Bank invested 1/3 of the project cost initially. It's well known. If you look at CNN or other media, they always talk about other DFIs, but not the African Development Bank. So not only African governments, investors need to step up their game in terms of branding, but also African Development Bank needs to step up their game in terms of branding. You go to Ghana Airport, amazing airport, nobody knows that it was funded by the bank. Yep. I think we need to do more, all of us. That's why my final word, because you're going to ask all of us, is to set up this Africa branding facility so that we can support African countries, brand themselves better, tell their stories. Because often in government, I know, the ministries of communication or whoever is in charge of branding, I don't even think that we have somebody in charge of branding. If you go to Dubai, they have a unit dedicated to branding Dubai. If, for example, there is a bad news on Dubai, whether it's Twitter, the CNN, the internet, what have you, they have a team that does not sleep 24 hours awake to react immediately to correct whatever misperception, whatever negative news. So my big idea is the Africa Branding Facility, ABF, African Development Bank to launch it, and I'm sure many other donors will be interested to invest in that facility to provide soft money, grant to countries to brand themselves better. Thank you.
Very, very well said. And I just want to add to that and say a company like Coca-Cola, for example, has been in business for almost 100 years, still spends about 20% of its total budget on communication, advertising, marketing-related issues, a huge amount of money. One would assume that for a company that's been in business for that long, it would spend much less than that on communication. But it hasn't. It spends a significant amount of money on communication. That, again, I think, speaks volumes for us as investors, as a continent and as nations. The fact of the matter is that if you're not in the communication business today, you are not in business. So I love the idea about the Africa Branding Facility. It's worth looking at, and I do hope that when we come back next year, we will have a different narrative in this regard. I want to also quickly respond to the issue about, we've heard artificial intelligence being talked about here, and almost in every conference we go to these days, you will hear the issue of artificial intelligence coming up. But I think this is another one of those areas where intentions are not matched by practice. And why do I say that? Artificial intelligence, the world of artificial intelligence is underpinned by STEM, science, tech, engineering, and mathematics. But only 2 to 3% of African graduates have STEM degrees. So policy has to match intentions somewhere along the way. We have to rethink our whole educational system if we're going to be prepared for the future that is right before us. We are trying to put our money where our mouth is at the African Development Bank. We've invested approximately $40 million in the Kigali Institute of Technology, supporting young engineers who are doing everything from robotics to nanotech and a whole number of other things. And we're really excited about what's happening in that space, and we hope that we can expand that to a whole lot more countries in the years ahead. So I'll come back to the panel here for that big wow idea. Or I think we still have one question that we haven't exhausted that was directed to the panel. Did I leave one of them out?
I think it was on content.
Oh yes, I think that was.
So I think
that was your question, Rakesh.
Yep, I guess I can talk about CNBC Africa and what we do at Forbes. Can't comment much on the quality of content that is created across other media platforms. We took a very concerted decision when we launched in 2007 that everything we do has to be balanced. And we have to have two sides to the story whenever it goes out. And our journalists have been trained in this in terms of our editorial guidelines. So it's not about holding on to what is happening, but making sure that there's two sides covered at all times. The quality of content, therefore, is very critical in what goes out and creating perceptions. We have created so much content. We've talked about leadership. We've talked about, what governments are doing in terms of policies. It's not that we don't discuss what is wrong, but we've also talked about the opportunities around it. And I'll give you an example. In 2008, and as a media owner, you come up with a lot of these circumstances where you have to make choices. When the elections in Kenya were going on, and there were riots on the street, and there were fires, and every media organization was reporting that Kenya has come to an end. It's at a standstill. There was a complete blackout that was done by the country. We were the only network that was allowed to continue because we were saying, yes, there is a problem, but there's business that is being conducted. The markets are open. People are going to work. So you always have to carry a balanced view. And that responsibility rests with our journalists. It rests with media owners. It also rests with the consumers. And also in the context of what some of our young friends were talking about in terms of the modern trends in social media, you also got to remember that today it's a double-edged sword. On one side, there's accountability that has been created with social media. But on the other side, you also have this issue where all kinds of rubbish is going out, and it actually demeans everything that people are doing. So I think we are going through a very, I'd say it's a metamorphosis in many ways in the evolution of media and how this is going to be managed in the long term. But the point is critical. The content that goes out has to be done with a lot of responsibility.
Thank you very much, Rakesh. And Lulu, I'm going to come to you. Do you want to respond to any of the questions that have been raised?
Well, I'll try and combine two things together.
You could speak into the mic.
Yeah, and Victor, I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm happy you are the one that moderating this. From my short experience in managing the short-lived rebranding exercise in Nigeria, one of the biggest challenges we had was financing. We had good ideas, we had the right strategy, we had everything. And I'm looking at Africa as a continent, and I believe the South African minister had said this as well. I believe very strongly that the ADB, your organization, must take this on and manage it across the continent. Every country has something that it can contribute, that it can talk about. The Nollywood in Nigeria is quite strong. It's a low-hanging fruit. There's a whole lot we can use in communicating across the continent. But the one thing that's always been missing is the financing. Can the ADB, maybe with some corporate sponsors, put a platform together for the entire region, for all of the countries, that will form the basis for communicating on a regular basis a message about Africa, the narration, the narratives about Africa.
Thank you very much, Lulu. And I actually concur with you there. I want to quickly visit what Minister Amadou Hott mentioned earlier about Ouarzazate. Ouarzazate, if you've never been there, it's a beautiful city, number one, in Morocco, but it also houses the world's largest concentrated solar power complex in the world. It's a technological marvel. The first time I read about it was 4 years ago. I wasn't at the African Development Bank at that time. I had absolutely no clue that the African Development Bank funded it. And I did read articles about Ouarzazate in Time magazine and The Economist. The only multilateral development bank that was mentioned, which happens to be a minority shareholder in that particular project, was the World Bank. The African Development Bank that funded close to, I believe it was more than 40%. The first phase, the African Development Bank funded about 75, almost 80% of the first phase of that. But there was not a single line, not a single mention in Time or in The Economist. And that's one of the reasons why I have always strongly believed that Africa must own its own narrative. We must tell our own story and not wait for others to tell it for us. But thank you again for mentioning that. I see a few more hands. I think we have time for a few more questions in the audience. The gentleman with a beautiful striped jacket in the middle, the lady up front here and over here, and the lady in the brown dress in the back. In that order. Thank you very much. And again, if you could direct your questions specifically to a member of the panel, that would be wonderful. Your name and the question.
My name is Samuel. I'm a great Nigerian, an African, and I believe in the positive stories of Africa. For a very long time, the West have owned the stories of Africa, told it in their own terms. But we, the Africans, we, the diasporas, we're just going to take this story away from them and tell it on our own terms. Honorable Minister, we miss you in London. I just only wanted to ask, your government is doing extremely well in telling the positive story of Africa. All of us are here today asking the government, the government, the government, the government. How about all of us here, the Africans, the diasporas, going out there and telling our stories in our own terms? I've been here since Sunday. I left for London on Thursday. For 10 days I've been in this country. I fly around the world, and each time I stay in high-level meetings, I always own the positive stories of Africa and telling it. All of us have to own this story, not only the government. The government is doing their best. Also, the African government are making a little bit money now. Please, 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 help us when you go out there in meetings to help us package projects. When you sit with investors that are ready to put money where projects are that can help create jobs and reduce poverty, but the way the projects are packaged, we need to help to package the projects properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was more comment than question, but still very much appreciated. Very valid one there. We'll take the second question here and then come back to my left.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. My name is Julie Wena. I'm a first-generation Nigerian American. I'm based in San Francisco, California. I'm an in-house lawyer at a very large tech company, and I'm now counseling on all of our Africa efforts. I did a ton of work in the government, in the United States government, in the White House for President Obama on the continent for Power Africa. So I've had a ton of opportunity to explore how the U.S. engages with Africa from a government perspective. but this is my first time doing it from a corporate perspective and really thinking through, now that I'm in this new role supporting the continent, I want to make sure that I have effective strategies in place to show my tech company why it's very important to engage in business on the continent. So I'd love some, Minister Gordon, you spoke about the economic proposition. Minister Hott, you spoke about the importance of showcasing, the reason why it's important to be on the continent. So I'm actually looking for strategies that I can use to bring back to my tech company so that it can be helpful in us engaging here in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And lady in front here.
Hello, my name is Rania Kargba. I'm from Sierra Leone, West Africa. So I struggle with Ebola stigma. I struggle with the malaria, Lassa fever when you talk to investors. And I'm trying to actually build a cancer hospital. So what advice do you give for, and how can government and also Mr. Wahi, what opportunities are there for us to showcase and show what we want to do and tell the stories and try to attract funding? Thanks.
Thank you. And the last question, lady in brown, way in the back. Yeah.
Hello. I guess my question kind of also links onto this gentleman over here talking about the importance of the diaspora in the conversation about showcasing positive stories about the continent. And so also specifically looking at the role of young people, given that there's this the year of the return, and there are a lot of young people in the diaspora kind of trying to search to find their heritage and connect with their heritage more. I wonder if there's anything you can talk more about that and how we can kind of push forward this success story.
Okay. All right, and we'll make this the last question and then come back to the panel.
Mine is not a question. If it is, then it still can be answered. My name is Elias Mpondela from Zambia, former CEO of National Housing Authority, and now chairman of the board of directors for Mpulungu Harbour, the only port we have for the Great Lakes region in the southern tip of Lake Tanganyika. For me, I think that no country is disadvantaged by its geographical location. The difficulty is in the mind. And so the first thing that we have to do as Africans is to rebrand our minds. Our mindset are in wrong place. We think we must get good countries. We think we must be a good continent, but our actions are directed at different things, what we say about ourselves. We talked about the demonstration effect. Up to now, we have not learned to honor and celebrate our successes. This morning, we saw a demonstration of the Toronto gentleman there, the winning of that, and we also talked about the Kenyan who ran the marathon under 2 hours. That was great. But that's not what we do on what we do in politics, in the economy, the successes that we succeed in the economy. The West enemy, therefore.
Okay, we want to limit this to questions.
Okay.
So if you're going to make a comment, could you kind of make it very concise?
Okay. So the West enemy of Africa are Africans themselves. That's the way our mindset is set up. So I'm recommending that aside from the communication center that was recommended by Honorable Hott there, that we create a political leadership regeneration factory where all leaders that are elected must go to train how to talk about their countries, what not to say and what to say. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Quite a few loaded questions there. Over to the panel. 2 seconds? All right. Your 2 seconds are up. All right, 2 seconds. We'll indeed make that the last question.
Thank you. I would be very brief. I'm the ambassador of Morocco to South Africa. I completely share the vision that was expressed today. We need the narrative, and also we need the expertise how to tell our story, because sometimes we don't tell very well our story. two, I think I didn't hear it today, but from an African perspective, I think we should do our own homework internally as African countries. Of course, build up strong economies, but also coherent societies, good governance, democracy, and so on. And this will help us to move forward. And finally, thank you very much for mentioning works like that, because here also we did our own homework. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I see a persistent hand up front, so I'll come to the lady here. How can I ignore that? So we will indeed make this, and that's the final word, the last question.
So my name is Denise Mante from the U.S. Department of State, and I cover Africa policy for Secretary. And I've heard a lot about youth engagement, and I think when we're talking about showcasing Africa, there's a huge wave of young people, and like the young lady here mentioned, the year of the return. And I know you had a list of some panelists, but I think it's important to incorporate young leaders in these kind of discussions because they have a huge, well, I'm also a young leader, but we have a huge advantage of pushing out a positive narrative on social media, right? And quite frankly, I haven't seen anything about Africa's youth bulge in any of the sessions for the AIF at all. And it would have been great to include a young leader on this panel to talk about how we can use social media as a tool to really narrate Africa's story and showcase the positive things that the youth is really taking control over. Thank you.
Very, very, very well noted there. And just before the panel takes over here, I just want to share something here that has grieved me for many years. If I was maybe a 15, 20-year-old today, which I'm obviously not, just reading the daily papers, it doesn't matter the country, pick up any newspaper in Africa today, it's doom and gloom. And I believe that we do our youth a great disservice, because if I were their age, I'll also be trying to get through the desert or onto a boat to get the hell out of here. We have a responsibility to give hope to the younger generation. So I use this opportunity to call for greater and much more responsible journalism to encourage the youth and give them a reason to want to stay and make a future on this continent that we all love. So at this point, I hand over to the panelists to take these questions and provide final thoughts on that big picture item I haven't forgotten yet. All right. So I see that Minister Hott wants to go first, so we'll start with you.
Yeah, just the question on Sierra Leone. It's sad that Sierra Leone is still victim of these past bad images, but I think one of the most powerful ways to correct it is really to try to focus and attract a wow investment in Sierra Leone, a credible investor. But that will take time and efforts. Your entire government would have to roll their sleeves to really convince one credible investor to come and then use that as a fantastic news that you can use to rebrand Sierra Leone. Just on the wow idea, I already mentioned the one, which is the Africa branding facility. I keep insisting is to provide technical assistance for African government to have their branding strategy and how to implement also that branding strategy. It's not big investments, it's really technical assistance. But the final word for me is really maybe in this Africa Investment Forum to include a session called maybe, did you know? Something, did you know? That has happened in several African countries that maybe nobody knew about. That was fantastic news, great things that were achieved by great investors, that were achieved by governments in Africa, by artists, by innovators. That needs to be known, but that is not known very much by the global audience. Did you know what does that was the whatever? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Hott. And as we give these final comments, I also want us to ensure that we address some of the issues and the questions that have been raised from the audience. So I will go in the order of Alain Bibose and then work our way all the way back here to Rakesh.
So I was thinking about the wow idea, and what I came up with. It's not very sexy and it's a bit hard to implement, but it's important. Focusing on infrastructure, we have a large infrastructure gap in Africa, and everybody says we need to try to bridge that gap in order to really to make a dent, to drive other investments. But one of the things that we also notice is that most of our pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, are not investing in infrastructure in Africa. There is an initiative which is calling for allowing them to invest a small portion, it's 5%, is the initiative. Let's make the 5% initiative allowing our pension fund, sovereign wealth fund, to invest in infrastructure in Africa happen, because if us Africans start to believe in ourselves and invest in our own project, other will follow. Because this is one of the questions sometimes that I get asked when I go and raise money outside of Africa. I ask, so can we get pension fund to, African pension fund to co-invest? And I'm like, okay, I'm not sure. This is not necessarily very good when your own people are not investing in our own assets. Let's get African pension fund and sovereign wealth fund to invest a small portion of their money into African infrastructure, and that would change the narrative.
Thank you very much, Alain Bossi. Thank you.
Well, to respond to some of the questions, I think the point about the diaspora is an important one. I think two of our colleagues have mentioned that. And that's a huge population in largely developed parts of the world. They send remittances back to their home countries, and that's an important source of foreign exchange, often for those countries as well. But they are the ideal ambassadors as well for their countries. And I think that's something, again, whether it's African Development Bank or some other institution, needs to mobilize in some kind of way. The second is in relation to, I think it's Julie's point about how do you attract investment from the US. Perhaps the African Development Bank can develop or formulate generic business cases for investing in dams in Africa, or in agriculture in Africa, or in social infrastructure in Africa as well. So there is a business case which says you can get return X, investment Y, security Z, but it might vary in different countries, but that's a template that people can actually work with at the end of the day. I think the point about walking the talk, as we would call it here, is an important one as well. I don't know whether this is a big idea, but the idea, the quintessence of youth is energy, innovation, and resilience. And I think we're not capitalizing not just on the youth bulge, but the innovative youth of Africa. So the suggestion is that we create an investment network of activists, or a network of investment activists amongst our youth, people who are involved in startups and other kinds of businesses as well. And the African Development Bank is well placed to actually establish such a network, and they probably have a greater potential to think beyond the borders of their countries and begin to develop a new 21st century brand of Pan-Africanism, if you like. And certainly that should be explored. And I want to end with a quote from Ben Okri. Our future is greater than our past, and that's about hope. And if we can believe that our future is great, then we'll get others to believe as well. But if we don't have confidence in ourselves and our own possibilities, then we aren't going to set the example for others. And that means, in some ways, what Elena has been saying, invest our own capital in African projects as well, and then crowd in others. And that might be, this is something we've been talking about for the last 10 years as well, but I'm not sure the extent to which it actually happens. That's another demonstration effect. Put your capital into African soil and get others to actually join you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Previn. Oluwakeomi?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think one of the questions mentioned something about brand properties and opportunities. If we're going to change the narrative for Africa, I think it's also critical, if you're talking of a regional brand, what are the things, what are the properties of the brand, what are the opportunities that are available for investment? I've got a few here just to quickly go through them. I think one of the things we've got to remember, and it's very critical to whatever type of communication we're going to send out, is that the consumer profile is changing within the region, and that is so important in whatever we're going to be communicating out there. The middle class is growing with certain expectations. Africans are traveling more, are better educated than a decade ago. We probably have the largest population of young people under the age of 25. Our taste has gotten more sophisticated, and so on and so forth. These are some of the things that will have to be part of the brand property. We also need to talk about our growing digital transformation. And this is already taking place. If you take a country like Kenya, for example, they've been able to do what no other country has been able to do in terms of getting banking to the rural population and using digitalization and all kinds of or other tools that they have used. Nigeria is likely to start that very soon, and everybody is full of expectation that possibly 2, 3, 4, 5 times of whatever has been done in Kenya is going to be recorded in Nigeria. I think one of the brand attributes that we also need to talk about is that we have a lot of opportunity in sustainable development, in energy, in technology, supply chain, flexible fuel grid, and so many things. If we are going to tell a story, all of these have to be the story. We have loads of things to talk about, agriculture, so many things that we can talk about that are part of the brand properties. And the fourth is that Africa needs huge investments in infrastructure. Unfortunately, there's a huge infrastructure deficit all over Africa in roads, transportation, rail, and so on and so forth. But they also present a huge opportunity for those who are going to invest in the continent. Power is also so critical. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is plagued by power outages over 600 hours every year, killing initiative, killing productivity, adding to the cost of business. These are some of the things that we can invest on, some of the things that we can talk about. And
thank you very much.
Finally, we can talk about reduced trade barriers and enormous intra-African trade potential, the 54-nation continental free trade area, reduced rates from country to country, what each country is doing. If we put all of this together and using the ADB as a platform to drive, maybe provide some of the funds, I think it would help put into perspective the kind of communication we should be sending out about Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lulu. And last but certainly not the least, Rakesh Wahi.
Thank you, Victor. I'd like to respond to your question. And we as a network do a lot of pro bono work. So I suggest rather than responding to it in a public forum, I encourage you to spend some time with me after this and we'll see what we can do for you. We most certainly would be interested. We have worked with NGOs and other organizations and done pro bono work. We'd be happy to do that. As far as the idea is concerned, I, as a businessman, go back to a simple philosophy that if you want to see something come to fruition, you have to fund it. If there's no money, there's no way you can change anything. And the key issue is, how do you raise that corpus of money or that war chest with which you can go to war? It has to be sustainable. And I think organizations like the AFDB should play an apex role, or the African Union, in making sure that you can collect money from all the countries, put together a war chest of about 300 to 400 million a year, and do it in a sustained manner, and have a common agenda, which is for the continent. This is not about country branding, this is about a continental branding. And unless and until you can put some money together, there's no way you'll be able to do a African narrative mindset change.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, could you kindly give our excellent panel a warm round of applause? I just want to close this evening with this thought, that visionary leadership is the ability to see the future long before it arrives, and the capacity to take a people who otherwise wouldn't have embarked on a journey successfully to their destination. This is what it's all about. I believe with all of my heart that the Africa we will see 5 to 10 years from now, because of the many developments that are going on in terms of investment, the visionary ideas, would be very different from the Africa that we see today. I am an eternal optimist. Yes, we do have challenges, but together we can and we will make a difference. Ladies and gentlemen, for being a wonderful audience today, for your great questions, we salute you also, and we give you, in turn, a warm round of applause. Thank you very much. And to our great panel today, I'd like to say thank you very much. Minister Gordon, I know you have a pretty tight schedule. Thank you very much for being a part of this event today. Minister Hott, your voice was failing when you walked in, but this panel has done your voice a whole world of good because you sound a whole lot better. Thank you very much for being here. Alain Ebobisse, thank you very much for being here. You're doing a wonderful job with Africa 50. Greatly appreciated. Lulu Akinwumi, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your great ideas that you presented. And also Rakesh Wahi, again, for your perspectives on the media and communication side. We thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, have yourself a wonderful, wonderful evening and a great rest of the Africa Investment Forum.